here we are again. It is the fourth CISO / security Superfriends, and I am super excited today. I could not be more excited because I have another CISO who, like me, has done this job 3 times. And she is a world adventurer, has great experience, particularly when it comes to cloud native, and that is Kathy Wang. Kathy, say hello.
Hello, it's great to meet you. And thank you so much, Rich, for having me on this podcast and webinar. This is fun.
Well, this is great. I'm really glad you're here. And Kathy is saying great to meet you to all of you, but we go a ways back, and she's gotten to be a great super friend because of her experience with cloud native and because of both my experience as a CISO and now in my new company. So I really try to collect people around myself who can help steer me correctly. But there's a real important question I have to ask her before we get started, and that is, what or who is your favorite superhero and why?
So I would say that my favorite superhero is Wolverine. And the reason why I pick Wolverine is not just because I went to University of Michigan and I'm a Wolverine myself, but if you look at how his past history is and how he's conveyed as a character, he's very much kind of a gray character where it's not like necessarily very black and white with him. Some of the other characters like Captain America, they're a little bit more black and white, but Wolverine, he kind of takes things as they are and he kind of rolls with the punches and then he figures out what's going to work for him. Right? And that is very much an embodiment of how security decisions are often made. We don't have perfect information. We rarely do. And we have to decide what is the best way to do this so that we can minimize risk. And that's never a very easy decision. So I feel like Wolverine's kind of the best embodiment of all of that.
All right. That was a very great answer. It's a super answer, which I would expect from you. Now, you may not know this, but Eli Kahn gave Wolverine as his answer. And then Aaron Stanley gave Triangle Man from They Might Be Giants, which was a funny answer. But I really like how you wove it in. And my summary of your answer is this, is that Wolverine, he's pretty much chaotic good from a Dungeons and Dragons perspective, tending towards chaotic neutral, but the reality is he's someone who's in the midst of chaos, where he doesn't always have all the right information to make all the right decisions, but he goes forth, and it's very much the embodiment of the security and how we go about doing war. So I love that answer. That's really awesome. So a lot of people tune in because they want to understand the path to CISO. They want to hear the superhero origin stories and all that. So you have a great one. Please tell the audience, how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, of course. So I really started out as a hardware engineer. I specialized in chip design, chip fab, semiconductor physics back when I was in college and grad school. And I made the transition to software and security about 20 years ago. And that was when I started working with compiling PAM modules. And that's like really old school stuff. But that kind of started me out in security and software. And then I took my first job as a security operations analyst very shortly after that at Bruce Schneier's startup company, Counterpane. And so that was my first startup job as well. So what that means is that there's this understanding of how hardware limitations will govern what software is able to achieve. I'm able to think about it from that perspective, which I really haven't met very many people in the security industry who have that same kind of perspective. But that topic could probably be a whole other webinar. It's so interesting to think about Moore's law and hardware. And even nowadays, we look at a lot of problems like supply chain poisoning issues and things like that. So I really like thinking about hardware as well. So once I started in security about 20 years ago, I never really looked back. I could have gone to work at Intel or AMD or one of those other chip fab kind of places, but I never did. So my security career took me, though, from security operations to security research, where I wrote several open source prototypes that I presented and BSD licensed or GPL v2 licensed at different security conferences. And I actually really enjoy security research. I focus very much on malware detection and response. And all of that knowledge that I gained from that period of time and the security operations knowledge really makes me more of a hands-on, a technical CISO, because I have a high degree of experience doing hands-on work. I really enjoy the challenge of good security, though, because what that means is it's not just about solving technical problems, it's also about solving business problems. You can do security by just solving technical problems, but it wouldn't be as good, right?
Okay. You are the first one to bring up Moore's Law, so you win a badge for that. You win the ephemeral Moore's Law badge. I think that's great. And you are absolutely right. I don't know a lot of folks. I mean, I know a small handful of CISOs who were developers. I'm one of those. I know a small handful of those. That's increasing as we go down the path. But you are the first CISO that has the hardware background. And I do think that's, you know, if you really want to think about what it means to talk about the roots of security and where it starts and really talking about getting close to the metal, pretty hard to get closer than that. So that's super cool. You know, I know though, and you're being humble, I know that you are also one of the early security leaders to get involved with cloud native. And I just want to touch on that real quick, just your history. You've worked in some, you know, like GitLab and whatnot. Can you maybe talk, before we get into your current job, can we just talk about the transition from, again, more hardware oriented to, you know, to really more software defined to everything? Like, what does that mean? You having your vantage point, again, where you have the hardware mindset, right? You started there, and now you're dealing with cloud native, even in your current job, cloud native everything. Just tell me a little bit about how having that hardware mindset has set you up for success in this new world.
Yeah, so when you're a hardware engineer, that probably means you're an electrical engineer, which I was. And that's sort of where I got the foundation training for how I think today, is from back then. Electrical engineers are very focused on thinking critically. When you're solving problems that are technical in nature, you need to make sure that you have the right data and that you ask the right questions to be able to approach and solve the problem. And I find that that training is so critical for solving security problems as well, because, you know, a good example is when you have a security incident, you might get you're gonna have to find out what happened, right? So there's the 5 whys of it, like who was involved in this, what happened, how did this happen, right? When did this happen? But that style of thinking, believe it or not, is not intuitive to most people. It has to be developed. And so I find it to be an advantage to have had that skill set developed in the past by having to pass the electrical engineering classes to begin with, which kind of started training me to thinking that way. And I apply that kind of skill set very happily in security. It's a great match.
That makes a lot of sense. And I've worked with a lot of engineers like yourself when I was at GE, for example. And I think you're right. I think there is a real distinction between actual engineers, people with real principled engineer training, and other people who may easily adopt the engineer title, but don't necessarily have that sort of critical thinking. I absolutely think it's much needed nowadays. So we'll come back to some of these things. I want to talk about very good security. Now, I just want to, you know, elephant in the room, people might say, gosh, that's a horrible name for a company, but you have to understand a little bit about the history of security to understand that's actually a great name, particularly given what the company does. But tell us a little bit about Very Good Security, the company, and what they do, the problems they're solving, and all that.
Yeah, so first about the name, I really like the play on, PGP here. We all know about PGP. And also, as a CISO, I love having the word security in the company name. How can I not like that, right? So very good security is all about data security and zero data. So what that means is very good security helps businesses get all of the benefits of using sensitive and regulated data, but without ever having to see or hold the data themselves. So if you think about why companies come into contact with sensitive data in the first place, like payment card info, identity data, it's typically because they have some sort of business objective that they need to accomplish. They need to get paid or run a background check or underwrite a loan. Sensitive data is simply inputted into that process. So VGS helps companies do whatever they need to do with the sensitive data, but without the overhead of having to secure that data themselves in a way that meets compliance requirements. So our customers can satisfy compliance standards like PCI, SOC 2, privacy requirements like GDPR or CCPA a lot more quickly and for less cost, which means that they accelerate their time to market and for a whole lot less cost of ownership and maintenance. So that's VGS in a nutshell.
Okay, I have a lot to ask you about data security and the cloud native world. I have two questions though, based on what you just said. First of all, explain to me a little bit more about what is zero data. You use the term zero data and kind of, rang for me, almost sounds like a bit like zero trust. What is zero data?
So zero data is not having to actually descope, store, process, tokenize all of your sensitive data on your own, right? You're basically outsourcing that service. That's what zero data means. It's tangentially related to zero trust because zero trust is a security model that assumes that every session or connection that you're going to make based on your role, your device, and the sensitivity of the data you're trying to access, there is going to be a separate authorization decision for that. So they are related, but they're not the same thing.
Okay. Well, you get another badge of honor, a Superfriends badge, because I've never heard the word zero data. Now I have. So you've like accumulated two of them. So that's really great. So, all right. VGS, correct me if I'm wrong, VGS is cloud native, using cloud native technologies, and we can define a lot about what cloud native is. And I believe your previous company, CISO Gig, was also cloud native. And I've gone through several versions of this myself, and they are not all the same. I mean, the space is just maturing so quickly. Can you tell me about what's the same, what's different between what you were doing before cloud native, what you're doing now? This is in part to help the audience also understand what a thought leader like yourself thinks cloud native actually is and how it's changing.
Yeah, that's very important to define. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Cloud native to me, it means that as a company, you don't have any sort of on-prem deployments. And you also don't do any self-hosting of your own cloud infrastructure. All of your data in your business operations depends on third-party SaaS infrastructure. So you would be building your infrastructure out on a public cloud, such as AWS or GCP or Azure, something like that. All of your HR systems or finance systems, all of your business operation systems are also on third-party infrastructure. And very often for cloud native companies, all of your employees are globally distributed and remote. So to be a true cloud native company, you would have all of those paradigms in place, and you would probably use a tech stack that includes a public cloud infrastructure as well as a lot of tools to allow you to communicate remotely, such as Slack or G Suite or Office 365. That's what your tech stack would look like. So for cloud native companies, right now at my current company, VGS, and at past company where I was at GitLab before, they're both cloud native companies in that way, in that definition. Of course, the business revenue drivers are different for VGS versus for GitLab, different types of products, different customer requirements and use cases. VGS is a security product company, which means that we have to be even more conscious about securing our products and services, protecting the company, and building trust and assurance with our customers. So those three things that I just mentioned happen to be my top level missions as CISO at VGS.
Great, thank you for that definition. You know, I think I'm going to start asking every single person who comes on here for their definition of cloud native, and that was real thorough. Thank you for that. So I have to assume that data security obviously is top of mind for you, and it's actually top of mind for any CISO, but I would argue probably for you even more so. So what approaches for locking things down without getting in the way of high velocity cloud native development are top of mind for you? So again, how are you going about doing data security in a really, environment that really requires you to be excellent at it? How do you do that without getting in the way of high velocity cloud native development that's going on in your organization?
That's a really great question. I think that I'm not that different from a lot of other CISOs, such as yourself, that have done this multiple times, right? I learned a really long time ago that security is a process that cannot be implemented in a way that blocks shipping of products or impedes business operations. The problem is if you are the type of security leader that implements security processes in that way, probably very quickly you'll be looking for your next role, right? So because that's the case, that we don't want to block shipping of products, we don't want to impede business operations, there's probably a more efficient and scalable way to build security processes. Everyone knows that there's never as many security engineers on any security team as there are developers, right, at the company. That's just how it is. And so what can we do to scale the security team and also empower developers or other departments that are involved to help themselves self-serve in some parts of the security process? I've been in this long enough to know that we can't fully automate away humans in the process. That's not going to work. Many people have tried, but it's not going to work. So there are ways to do this, right? We can, for example, we can self-empower developers to make decisions earlier on in a development process. This is part of a SDLC process that developers can say, hey, you know what can I do now to tell myself what I'm working on implementing is something that I absolutely should get security reviews on. That's one way to do it. Another way is to say, at the time of code commit, right, what automated measures are in place to help me decide whether I do want to commit this code from a security perspective. Those are all tooling and automation and processes that can help to shift things left to the developers and empower them to make good decisions and also scale the security team. This is really, really important.
That was, again, very thorough answer. And I hope you former, existing, and soon-to-be CISOs are taking notes because you have someone who's had multiple cloud native experiences, but also, again, goes all the way back to hardware. And I think I think, Kathy, I think you should be writing a book, by the way. Having written a book and writing another one, I think you have a lot to offer. So with that last question, I have to assume again, here you are dealing with data security as a company, having to deal with it as, as CISO in a high velocity cloud native organization. I have to additionally just assume, by very nature of all that, that regulatory compliance is just huge for you. So how do you balance the demands of going fast, right? Moving fast, cloud native development, and the needs to meet what are times perhaps draconian, data security requirements. I mean, even put on you, right? Obviously your customers are using you, but you are this large repository now of all that. So how do you, again, balance those requirements? Got to go fast, got to compete, and have a ton of regulatory compliance. How do you
Yes.
manage?
Yeah, so that is a very tough question. So when it comes to compliance, I think it's worth talking about the difference between compliance and security here. Compliance is about a starting point. You want to be compliant with PCI, DSS, SOC 2, CCPA, whatever it is. But then that's your starting point, that then you have to build kind of a security approach on top of that to raise the bar continually. Excuse me for a sec. Okay, so it's not easy to do that, right? So, but at the same time, you have to allow developers to do their work. Everyone has to be able to ship products. So you have to take this sort of a continuous approach and say, what can we do that is both reactive and proactive in this whole development pipeline? So what that means is you have to build in more proactive measures like internal reviews early on in the process, automation to allow for decisions about committing code at the time of deployment. And then you also have to understand that you're not going to catch 100% of everything. Security is never 100%, first of all, but you're not going to catch 100% of everything. So what are the reactive measures, whether it's red teams that do threat modeling, or it's vulnerability research teams that look for ways to exploit the existing code base, or it's bug bounty programs, for example, like HackerOne, where you're now outsourcing some of the research to hackers external to the company. So all of this has to work together hand in hand with compliance starting points to help you achieve a comprehensive security posture look, but also still at the same time allowing for business operations and for continuous delivery of product and shipping. So I don't know if this is like cruel and unusual requirements. To me, I think it's very standard to see this type of requirement, especially if you're a cloud native company. You're definitely going to see this all the time. And it's expected for a CISO to be able to handle these types of requirements.
We should consider doing a panel like this sometime on data security and cloud native. The reason I bring that up is, part of cloud native, particularly if, let's say it's Kubernetes, you're by very nature dealing with distributed compute at scale. And so when going back to some of your definitions as well, you're talking about a lot of SaaS providers, when you're one, right? Where you as a company are, if you be it my company, your company, or other companies, you're going to be collecting data from customers and then distributing that across a variety of environments. And while a lot of the shared responsibility model from a stack perspective may be owned by those third parties, you are still accountable from a data perspective. I mean, that's one thing I'd say. As we continue to, as the shared responsibility model expands for the cloud providers, the thing that you and I will always retain is data, accountability. How do I know that? Because you see what happens in terms of class action lawsuits. You see what's happening from a regulatory perspective. It's going to be a thing that's actually going to grow. Again, the idea that cloud native development exposing more value to more people through more channels, we should expect that to expand. So we're almost done. I've got two questions. This is a question I always ask CISOs, and this is build versus buy. You know, again, you're cloud native. You're in an environment with a bunch of developers. You probably have security folks who are like yourself, who are engineers and developers and whatnot. I've worked at companies where it's like, you know, it's if it's not invented here, no way, to all the way to the other spectrum, right? So I'm just curious, where do you sit on from philosophically on that, and your company, where are you on that spectrum, particularly for security?
Yeah, so I have a background as a open source developer myself, and I actually don't call myself a developer. I'm a prototyper. So I build stuff that works in demos for conference presentations, but I'm not someone who's a full software developer. But because of that background, I do have a soft spot for open source solutions and open source software. And the thing about the balance of that, though, is it scalable? Is it enterprise grade, right? Is it going to work for the different company environment other than the use cases it was developed for? So another thing that I do have a lot of experience with is doing highly technical product evaluations, especially around security products. I spent years doing that in the past as a defense contractor for various government organizations. So I know firsthand that what you see isn't necessarily what you get when it comes to reading the documentation and looking at the performance of a product. So it's very important to me when my teams look at buy versus build solutions that we conduct a thorough technical evaluation of 2 to 3 different products or open source code or open source packages to see how all of that maps out across the requirements and use cases that we have. I don't see a lot of people who seem to know how to do that very well. But to your question about, you know, buy versus build, you have to probably lean more on buying when you have a very lean or small team, because otherwise you don't really have the full bandwidth to build out a whole solution yourself. But it makes sense as your team grows to look at more build solutions, because with the builds, the nice thing is that you can often customize it for your specific use case, which might be considered too snowflakey, right, for a vendor to actually focus on implementing. So I think it makes sense from both perspectives, but it depends on the team, the skill sets, the bandwidth, and also your use cases. But you have to do a thorough evaluation based on requirements. Too often I just see people say, yeah, I'll just pick a product, vulnerability scanner. I just need a vulnerability scanner. But have you thought about why you need one? Documented it, gotten all the input from different stakeholders, right? Like your infrastructure team is going to be a stakeholder of this because they're going to worry about availability being impacted by this scanner. That's normal. But if you haven't looped them in, what's going to happen is you're going to deploy this and you might get pushback at that point. That's not when you want to find out about this, right? So people can do better, I think.
Yeah. Oops, that's a really good point, actually. And just on that subject of vulnerability management, you know, in cloud native world, if let's say you're in an environment where you're dealing with distroless, right? Your immutable infrastructure, and your first choice is, well, I'm going to go buy a traditional scanner. I mean, that's probably the worst choice. Unfortunately, I've actually seen that happen. I've talked to CISOs recently who they get dropped into a cloud native environment, and they're not in, you know, no fault of their own, I suppose. They just don't understand that they're dealing with a whole set of new primitives, right? In terms of just the, you know, the API for distributed computing. They're not familiar with that, and they go about doing what might be a traditional thing, and they, you know, well, they learn eventually, or they get a new job. But you know, one thing you said too that I suppose I would encourage the entrepreneurs out there who are listening: you're going to have a solution that plays well with others. you're going to have a solution that's really API first. It just has to. And I think a lot are heading that direction. I mean, CLI, you're going to have a solution that has a CLI. You have to kind of start from those points of views. If you start with the point of view that I'm going to have a great GUI, which is great, you have to have that. When you deal with people like Kathy and her teams and the organizations she's worked with, well, obviously they're going to want that. I believe that they're going to always have an appetite for simple integration. I mean, again, companies are different, their business models are different, where they are in their maturity is different. You can't, there's not going to be one size that fits all. So you have to be able to fit into that ecosystem. So with that being said, I have one last question for you. You are a 3-time CISO champion. You're on the bleeding edge of bleeding edge steps. What advice do you have for the up and coming security folks? Other than saying run for the hills, what advice do you have for them?
I actually don't think they need to run for the hills. I think they need to focus on, figuring out what their strengths are and where they're not as good, because it's impossible for any one CISO to be deep dive knowledgeable in every area in security. That just doesn't happen. It's a really broad field. So if you know where you are maybe not as strong, that's where you need to hire someone who can help to augment that area. So CISOs need to be very, very self-aware of what their strengths are and where they're not as strong, because we kind of need to check our egos at the door and be willing to listen, and also, accept that the way you did things, I'm going to say this because, I've been a multi-time CISO now. The way you did things before, even if it worked, may not be the best approach for your current role as CISO. That too, right? Sometimes people just think they can take that formula that worked before, plug it into here. Even let's say they're both cloud native companies. Yeah, so this formula that worked here might not work here because your culture is going to be different at this company. Your, skill sets are going to be a little bit different. So you have to be able to adapt. So CISOs who are good at what they do are able to adapt and also not impede business operations as much as possible. And I won't say that security processes are zero friction, because they have to be to some extent, because you're adding additional steps. However, you have to figure out how to minimize that friction, right? Because we all know if you don't, what do people do? They work around you. And that's not effective either. So think about all of that as you're thinking about a CISO gig, and where you're really strong and maybe where you're not. And check your ego at the door, because the last thing we need is a CISO who thinks they know everything. That never works.
All right, check your ego at the door. Realize that what you did before, even if it was fantastically successful, may not work here. Also realize that you don't need to know everything, but know what you're good at, and hire really smart folks around you. I think that does sound like a great recipe for success. So I just want to thank Kathy again for being a security super friend to the universe, and in particular to me. She's been very generous yet again in hanging out with me. Always appreciate it. And again, I really, really am so thankful for you, Kathy, and I hope that you take up my idea of writing a book.
Yeah, I've co-authored a book before, and it was so much work. I'm not sure that I want to do it again anytime soon, but it's a good advice. And, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. And, we'll talk again.